My name is Colin Blakemore. I'm here to welcome you to the 7th Anne Silk lecture, which is going to be given this year by Ed Bullmore. Ed is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. The Anne Silk lecture is an annual lecture which is sponsored by the Silk Charitable Trust. It's co-organised by the Royal Society of Medicine and the British Neuroscience Association, and it's given alternately at the RSM in London and at these festivals of neuroscience. The overarching theme of the Anne Silk lectures is progress in neuroscience across the whole range of effort, from fundamental research right through to translational and clinical research. We're especially grateful to Dr. Anne Silk herself, who's the founder of the Charitable Trust, for sponsoring these public lectures. This year's Anne Silk lecture will be given by Ed Bullmore. He's Professor of Psychiatry at Cambridge, and also he's Vice President of Experimental Medicine at GSK, GlaxoSmithKline. He studied medicine at Christ Church in Oxford and finished his clinical training at Barts in London. He taught for a year. He taught for a year in Hong Kong, and then trained for his specialization in psychiatry in London. He then did a PhD at King's College in London, working in the then emerging field of magnetic resonance imaging of the brain, and his international reputation is largely built on his computational approach to the analysis of MRI and the network connectivity which can be revealed through MRI and the time analysis of signals from the brain. He's been Professor of Psychiatry at Cambridge since 1999 and joined GSK in 2005. His commitment clinically has been to the understanding of mental health disorders, particularly from a biological perspective, wanting to know how the brain is responsible for mental conditions. And in his very recent public book, which I really recommend you should look at, the Inflamed Mind, it's a wonderful read, describes an interesting personal conversion, almost a kind of Paulian moment in his career, in which his interpretation of the origin of mental disorders has changed really quite radically. And that's what he's going to talk to us about tonight, I presume, since the title of his lecture is Inflamed Depression. Ed Bullmore.
Well, good evening. Thank you, Colin, for that introduction. It's a real honor to be invited to give the Anne Silk lecture, and thank you all for turning out on this evening to hear me talk about depression. As you have heard, I work half-time for GSK and half-time for GlaxoSmithKline, which is, of course, a pharmaceutical company, and these are my full disclosures just for transparency. But my story really starts when I started training as a psychiatrist, and that was around about 1989, 1990. And I found myself at this place, which is the Maudsley Hospital in South London, which at that time, certainly we were taught, and I understood it to be, the epicenter of British psychiatry, the place where anybody who wanted to be anybody in British psychiatry should go for their training. And it is a wonderful place in terms of the research and educational culture. And there I am, about 30 years ago, looking quite pleased with myself in the slightly grotty surroundings of the Maudsley Hospital. And one of the things that taught me more than anything else while I was there was an interview I had with a patient who came to see me in the outpatient clinic. I'd probably been a psychiatrist or a trainee psychiatrist for not much more than a year. And this man, late 30s, early 40s, came in and he said, I'm feeling bad. I can't concentrate. My work performance has dropped off. I look to the future, I can't see anything worth living for. I look into the past and I just find a lot of memories I feel guilty about. My appetite's not what it was. I've lost a bit of weight. I can't remember when I last had sex. and sometimes I'm wondering if life's really worth living. And I looked at him, and in what I hoped was a wise way, I said, you know what, I think you might be depressed. And he was very unimpressed by that remark. He said, look, I know I'm depressed. That's the reason I'm here. I asked my GP to refer me because I knew I was depressed. The question is, what are you going to do about it? And I said, oh, well, you know, it's a great time for treatment of depression, a lot of excitement. There's new drugs, for example, Prozac, you might have heard of, serotonin-boosting drugs just been released. We're very excited about them, and we believe that if you had those drugs, it might sort of fix this chemical imbalance in your brain that abnormal levels of serotonin might be causing your symptoms. And he looked at me sharply and he said, well, how do you know that? And I began to kind of regurgitate the stuff I'd just been reading about in the textbooks, the serotonin theory of depression and so on. And he said, no, look, how do you know that about me? How do you know the levels of serotonin in my brain are unbalanced? And we looked at each other, and I think for a moment both recognized that I had no answer to that question. In fact, I had no clue how to find an answer to that question. But having peered into the abyss of my ignorance, we politely found other things to talk about, and after a while he left the clinic with a prescription for Prozac or some other serotonin-boosting drug. But he left me feeling a bit of a fraud. He left me feeling like one of these guys, the sort of 18th century physicians so mercilessly satirized by Molière, who, by their erudite palpation of the pulse, were able to diagnose these subtle disturbances of humours circulating in the body, the black bile, the choler, and so on, often as a prelude to some rather unpleasant treatment. He left me feeling like a bit of a quack, if I'm honest. Now, if we jump forward 30 years and look at where we are in terms of the treatment of depression, one of the startling things is that nothing much has changed. The drug treatment of depression, the mainstay, is still the kind of drugs that I was talking about in the Maudsley outpatient clinic back in 1990. These drugs boost levels in the synapse, in the communication channel between nerve cells, where serotonin, adrenaline, and noradrenaline work as neurotransmitters. All of these drugs are supposed to increase transmission between nerve cells by boosting the levels of those molecules. And I don't mean to be nihilistic. It's not like these drugs are utterly useless. They do work moderately well on average, and you can see that quite clearly in this chart. And this is the result of a meta-analysis. In other words, an accumulated analysis of all the clinical trial data on antidepressant drugs that were available at the time. And just to orientate you, because you'll be seeing a few of these kind of charts, generally speaking, the vertical line indicates no difference between a drug, the active drug, and a placebo. And each of these little blue squares indicates the difference in terms of antidepressant efficacy of one of a number of antidepressant drugs shown here on the left. Now, if these drugs didn't work, then these little blue boxes and the horizontal lines that run through them would intersect this vertical line, indicating that there was no significant difference between antidepressant drug treatment and placebo. And as you can see, hopefully from the back of the hall, actually all of these drugs are, by this measure, significantly different from placebo. But we still have a lot of questions. We still don't have a very good answer to the question that patient asked me back in 1990. How do we know in any particular patient that there are abnormal levels of these neurotransmitters? We don't. Partly for that reason, we're not very good at predicting who's going to respond and who's not going to respond to these treatments. And we know that about at least a third of patients will not respond very well to these drugs. There's been very little therapeutic progress. If there had been therapeutic progress, you might expect that this drug, right at the top, which is furthest away from the vertical line of no effect, would be the newest. But in fact, it's amitriptyline. As some of you may know, that's one of the oldest antidepressants. It's been out there since the early 1960s. So not much progress, and yet depression is far from cured. It's still very common. If you look at the top 20 causes of medical disability around the world, depression is consistently in the top 1 or 2 or 3. In fact, some people think that in coming years, depression is on track to become the single biggest medical cause of disability worldwide. So very high levels of unmet need, not very much therapeutic innovation. You might think that was a big driver to invest, to find new treatments. But in fact, the industry has retracted, withdrawn from the area. And this came home to me very sharply in 2010, when I and a number of other GSK colleagues were called to a teleconference with some urgency, and I heard my boss at the time announce that with immediate effect, we were out of psychiatry. We were going to close 2 big research sites, one in Italy, one in England. Dozens of projects were going to be terminated, hundreds of jobs were going to be made redundant. It was a complete wipeout of psychiatry. And a few weeks after that, I went back to my boss a little bit plaintively, and I said, well, I know it's not all about me, but forgive me, I'm having a moment of existential crisis. I'm a psychiatrist working for a company that doesn't seem to want to do psychiatry anymore. Can you tell me, is there any hope? Would we ever go back and do drug development for depression again? And he said, well, I'd never say never, but if we were going to do drug development for depression again, it would have to be completely different to the way we did it in the past, because we know that was not working, that we were putting in hundreds of millions of pounds into R&D, and we were not finding any great new treatments. So come back and tell me how we could do it differently. And that really got me thinking. It got me thinking about an area of psychiatry that I'd sort of heard about but hadn't paid too much attention to up until that point. The idea that the immune system might have something to do with mood and other mental states. And the first time I heard that idea, I thought it was a bit nuts. But as I hope to persuade you over the next 40 minutes or so, there is actually some pretty good reasons why that might be a line of inquiry worth pursuing further. But before I go there, let me just say a little bit about the immune system. What is it? What does it do? Well, one of the things the immune system does, probably its single biggest purpose, is it keeps us alive in a world full of hostile agents out to get us. It's a crucial part of our survival package, and particularly in the old days. And here you can see, in the old days, a couple of cavemen having a fight in an era way before hospitals and hygiene and antibiotics. And one of them has been injured. A spear has pierced his hand, and a few days later, his hand has changed. It's become swollen, reddened, it's tender, it's painful, it's not as useful to him as it used to be. It's lost its normal function. Those are the classical clinical signs of inflammation. And inflammation is one of the things that the immune system does, particularly as a first-line response to defend us against infection. Now, what is driving those kind of obvious clinical signs of inflammation is actually a very complex pattern of molecular and cellular events that we can see microscopically. And I've shown this here very schematically. Here's the spear coated with these sort of unpleasant-looking bacteria. So it's an infectious trauma penetrating the skin, and the first line of response is these cells. I've drawn them as like kind of Pac-Man motifs, but they're designed to represent macrophages, a Greek word meaning big eating cells. And that's what they do. They're big cells and they eat bacteria. They digest them, they destroy them, and that is one way that they cope with the threat of infection. But they also produce these inflammatory proteins, or hormones, if you will. The technical word for them is cytokines. They come out of the macrophages, they get into the blood, and they circulate throughout the body, stimulating other macrophages elsewhere to come to the site of infection, to reinforce the first-line response. Now, there's an awful lot of detail that I'm not including in this diagram, but the key thing to get out of this slide is that although inflammation might look local, the swelling and the tenderness and the pain might be restricted to the hand. In fact, the inflammatory response is generally systemic. It generally involves the whole body to some extent, and certainly the whole immune system. And the immune system is, one of the things I think people can find difficult about it is first of all, the question of its location. The nervous system is We know at least that 90-something% of it is in one place, in the head, in the brain. But the immune system is much more distributed. It's in the spleen, it's in the bone marrow, it's in the thymus gland, it's in the lymph nodes. It's everywhere. And it has to be everywhere because threats to our survival can come from anywhere. So the macrophages that I talked about sitting in the hand, they're also present in the gut, in the gums, around the teeth, everywhere in the body which might be exposed to infection. The front line of the self, if you will, is manned by these centurion-like cells sitting quietly, for the most part, waiting for infection, and then mobilizing a response. But the macrophages alone signal through command and control centers like the spleen and the lymph nodes. They communicate with other immune cells like lymphocytes and encourage the lymphocytes, for example, to produce antibodies that circulate back through the blood and can help the macrophages deal with the infection or whatever the local threat to the self happens to be. So the key thing is it is a system, it's a complex system, it's highly integrated, it's adaptive, it learns, it has a memory, it also has an inbuilt or innate capacity to detect threat. It's a crucial part of the reason why we're all here, that we've all survived, is the vigilance of the immune system. Now, what's that got to do with depression? Well, I would dare to say that all of us have had first or second-hand experience of an association between depression and inflammation. I first really recognized this about a year before I started at Maudsley. Before I started as a psychiatrist, I was still training as a physician. And I saw a lady like this, I call her Mrs. P, who came to a medical outpatient clinic because she had problems with her hands, swollen tender joints in her hands, slight muscle wasting, some disfigurement of her hands and other joints. And I spent a bit of time talking to her about these and other symptoms and signs of rheumatoid arthritis, and it was all pretty clear-cut diagnostically. And then, perhaps because I was already thinking I might be a psychiatrist rather than a physician, I started asking her about her state of mind. And in language very similar to the words that I'd later hear from the man I met at the Maudsley, she told me that she was lacking in energy, she really struggled to get going in the morning, it was very difficult for her to concentrate on things, she felt like her brain was in a fog, she was pessimistic about what the future might hold. In short, she was depressed. And I thought that I'd made a bit of a diagnostic discovery. I rushed to tell the consultant in charge. I said, you know, Mrs. P, she's not just got rheumatoid arthritis, she's also depressed. And this man looked at me and said, depressed? Well, you would be, wouldn't you? And with that, we changed the subject and talked about something else. And Mrs. P left the clinic as depressed as she had been when she arrived, with no suggestion about how to make her mental state improve. Now, that simple expression, well, you would be, wouldn't you, to my mind now, speaks to quite a complex set of assumptions about many things in medicine. You could, for example, go back to the days of Descartes, I beg your pardon. Before going back to the days of Descartes, let me just make the point that this lady, Mrs. P, her experience is not that unusual, it's not that uncommon. Depressive symptoms are very commonly associated with medical inflammatory disorders. These are data from clinical trials done by GSK and Janssen in patients with arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, psoriasis, and so on. And what you see here is that in these patients, about 10 to 30% of them have significant depressive symptoms, particularly patients with rheumatoid arthritis. Indeed, you can show that the incidence of depressive symptoms in these medical inflammatory disorders is positively correlated with levels of an inflammatory protein called CRP, or C-reactive protein, that we can measure in the blood. So there's a very strong association when you look in inflammatory disease. These patients very often have depression and fatigue, anxiety, and other psychological symptoms. It's not unusual. But we don't really look in that direction very acutely in ordinary medical practice. We tend to say, well, you would be, wouldn't you? And as I mentioned earlier, I think that covers quite a complex set of assumptions. You could say it goes back to the work of Descartes, who in the early 17th century formulated this idea of dualism, the split between a body that exists in the physical world, obeys the laws of physics, is mathematically tractable, experimentally knowable, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the mind, or as Descartes called it, the soul, which in every way is as different from the physical world as it's possible to be. It's immaterial, it's insubstantial, it is in some way connected to God rather than the physical materiality of the world. We are each a deus ex machina, in Descartes' famous phrase. And that, although it might not be explicitly regarded as a part of the medical education, is an assumption that is still very prevalent in medicine and still has a lot to do with how medical training is organized, how medical services are provided, and so on. So maybe when the consultant said to me, well, you would be, wouldn't you? He was drawing on his deep knowledge of early Enlightenment philosophy. Or maybe, like me, he thought it must be the case that Mrs. P was depressed because you would be, because if you knew that your future held, in all probability, the prospect of increasing disability, you would rationally reflect on that and psychologically conclude that the outlook was gloomy. That is the conventional explanation. The alternative explanation could be that the inflammatory process in her body was more directly driving the changes in her mind. But we couldn't really allow ourselves to think that in the late 1980s or early 1990s because, as I was taught at medical school, the brain was immune privileged. It was kept completely apart from the immune system in the body by something called the blood-brain barrier, which was conceived to be a bit like the Berlin Wall in the brain. It was an impermeable barrier which made it impossible for immune cells and proteins circulating in the blood to get across from the blood into the brain and have any effect either on the kind of transmitters like serotonin that we thought were important for depression, or the larger scale organization of the brain, the networks that link areas such as the cingulate and the amygdala to form large-scale circuits that are important for mood regulation, and mood disorders. When we saw Mrs. P in 1990, the Berlin Wall in the brain was securely in place, and the idea that the immune disorder in her body could have propagated through the blood-brain barrier and had any effect on any of this, microscopic or macroscopic circuitry that might ultimately explain her mood, was inconceivable. What if you look not so much at people who have inflammatory disorder and ask, are they depressed, but turn the question the other way around and look at people who are depressed and ask, do they have any evidence of inflammation? And if you do that experiment, and people began to do this in about 1990, if you just take blood from patients with depression, healthy controls, you measure inflammatory proteins and compare the difference between them, you can see that over time, over the last 25 years, as people have done that experiment over and over again, very consistent evidence has emerged. And again, I'm showing you meta-analytic results, so you're looking for these little horizontal lines should be clearly apart from this vertical line here in the middle. If there was no difference between depressed people and healthy controls in these levels of cytokines, the horizontal lines would cut the vertical line. But you can see that as the evidence has accumulated, it's become clear that there are indeed modest but highly significant, highly replicable increases in inflammatory proteins, cytokines, and C-reactive protein, shown here, in patients with depression. So we have evidence, both from looking at arthritis and depression, and from looking at depression and inflammatory markers like CRP and interleukin-6, a cytokine, that depression and inflammation are associated with each other. And I think that is beyond reasonable doubt. I think we have to accept that as a fact, that there is an association to be explained. The question then becomes, how do we explain it? And in particular, what's the evidence that this association could be causally explained, that inflammation might be directly driving depression? Now, there's a lot of evidence for that argument from animal experiments. As people may know, if you make an animal inflamed, it very immediately changes its behavior in ways that make it look as if it might be depressed. Its social behavior changes, its eating behavior changes, sleeping behavior changes. It's less inclined to prefer sweet fluid over plain water, as if it had lost its normal pleasure-seeking capacity to prefer sweetened liquid. So there is a lot of animal evidence in favor of causality. But what about the human evidence? Now, obviously, there are many things that we can do with animal experiments that we simply can't in humans. But one simple way of beginning to get at causality is to look at events unfolding in time. Causes precede effects. So if inflammation caused depression, we'd expect to find examples of inflammation preceding or anticipating depression. And this little bar chart here is showing you one, I think, quite striking example of that temporal precedence. These are data from a birth cohort that was set up several years ago in Bristol in southwest England. So everybody born in a particular year was recruited into the study and then followed up year after year, longitudinally over time. At the age of 9, a blood sample was taken from these children and tested for levels of IL-6, an inflammatory cytokine. 9 years later, when the kids were 18, 19 years old, they were assessed for depression. And what the bar chart is showing is that the level of IL-6 at the age of 9 was quite a strong predictor of the risk of depression at the age of 18. If you were a child whose levels of cytokines were in the bottom third of the distribution at the age of 9, you've got a significantly reduced risk of depression compared to a child whose levels of cytokine were in the top third of the distribution, age 9. So that is inflammation preceding depression over the span of about 9 years. And you can see other examples of the same sequence. If you have a vaccination, I had a vaccination a couple of years ago. I went to the clinic. The nurse said, I'm going to give you the shot. You might think about taking tomorrow off work because you're not going to feel so great. I said, why? She said, well, that's just the body's way of getting used to things. So not a very good explanation, but it was quite an accurate prediction. I didn't feel so great the next day. I'd been inflamed by the vaccination. My mood changed subsequently. Another example, hepatitis, nasty viral infection of the liver. One of the first effective treatments was to give people a shot of a cytokine to make them more inflamed so that the immune system would be, as it were, motivated to hunt down and kill the virus in the liver. It worked quite well for hepatitis, but one unexpected and unintended consequence was about 6 weeks later, up to a third of those patients were significantly depressed. They'd not been depressed before, but they became depressed after they'd been exposed to an inflammatory shock like interferon. So that, I would say, satisfies a necessary condition for causality, that inflammation precedes depression, but it's not clearly sufficient. We need a more detailed, mechanistic, step-by-step understanding of how inflammation in the body could cause something to change in the mind. And as I mentioned earlier, that mechanistic pathway was blocked historically by the impermeability of the blood-brain barrier. But just as the Berlin Wall has come down since 1989, so in the same period, roughly speaking, not for the same reasons, the blood-brain barrier we now understand to be much more permeable than we did 30 years ago. We now know that there are many channels of communication, in fact, between the peripheral immune system in the blood and the brain. There are many ways in which inflammatory proteins, and indeed inflammatory cells, can get across the blood-brain barrier or signal inflammatory states across the blood-brain barrier. And once those peripheral inflammatory signals have made it into the brain, they can activate the brain's own immune cells. The macrophages or microglia that sit in the brain can be stimulated by a peripheral inflammatory signal to release their own cytokines. And we know, again, mainly from animal experiments, that nerve cells exposed to high levels of these inflammatory proteins often change their function in a disadvantageous way. It makes nerve cells more likely to die. It changes their synaptic plasticity. It changes their metabolism of transmitters like serotonin. So there is a mechanistic sequence that we can see more clearly in animals than in humans still, but there is a sequence of events that is conceivable whereby peripheral inflammation signals across the blood-brain barrier, changes central inflammatory cell activity, microglial activity, which in turn changes neuronal function, which could alter large-scale circuits and lead to changes in mood states. That is conceivable. What's the evidence for that in humans? Well, we've known for a long time, in fact, this goes back to Darwin, that our ways of expressing emotion are rather stereotyped. And it's correspondingly quite easy to detect emotion in the faces of other people. And if you look at these faces, happy, sad, fearful faces, we know that that tends to induce in the viewer the same kind of emotional state as represented in the face. We also know that if you look at those faces while you're lying in an fMRI scanner, simply looking at a sad face, for example, will tend to increase the amount of activity, the functional activation of areas of the brain, like the cingulate and the amygdala, that are important for emotional processing and mood disorders. And this basis, a colleague of mine, Neil Harrison, did an interesting experiment. He said, okay, we'll scan people while they're looking at these emotional faces, but we'll do it twice. Once after they've had a typhoid vaccination, and once after they've had a placebo injection. And as I've mentioned, a typhoid vaccination makes you inflamed. That's the point. It arouses the immune system. And what they showed in this experiment was that the people that had had the typhoid vaccination, they became a bit more depressed. The levels of inflammatory protein were increased in their circulation. But crucially, the people that became more depressed also showed greater changes in this brain region, part of the emotional brain circuitry. And indeed, the connectivity, the functional connectivity between cingulate, amygdala, and other components of the emotional brain network was significantly correlated with the increase in inflammatory proteins induced by vaccination in this experiment. So it's an example of how we can begin to unpick, step by step, how a peripheral inflammatory change can cause changes in brain function and in turn changes in mood. Now, if you've followed the argument so far, I've claimed that it's beyond reasonable doubt that inflammation and depression are associated with each other, that relationship satisfies a necessary condition for causality, which is that inflammation can precede depression, and that there is emerging evidence from animal and human studies for a mechanistic sequence of events that could explain how inflammation might cause depression. But you might then ask the question, and it's a question that you could ask of any causal explanation, what causes the cause? If inflammation causes depression, where does the inflammation come from in the first place? And there are, in fact, a number of bodily factors, that many of which are already identified as associated with depression, that we are increasingly aware also increase inflammation. Obesity, for example. The higher the BMI, the higher the body mass index, the greater the fat mass, all other things being equal, the greater the level of inflammatory proteins in circulation. Gut microbiome, big focus of research, particularly here in Ireland with people like Ted Dine and John Crynham working on this. In our guts, we have about 1.5 kilograms of bacteria, of germs. You could change the diet, you change the bacterial population, maybe the immune cells in the lining of the gut see that as a threat, maybe they mount an inflammatory response. Maybe that's one way in which diet could change mood. Chronic periodontitis, or gum disease. I'll spare you the gory details, but if you're interested, there's more about this in the book. It's one of my personal experiences of chronic inflammation. It's overlooked often. Psychiatrists don't tend to inspect people's teeth. Dentists don't tend to ask people about their mental states. Menopause, age, all associated with increased risks, or increased levels of inflammatory proteins in the literature. Even the winter months, there's quite a strong seasonal cycle of inflammatory cytokines with higher levels in January, February in the northern hemisphere, July, August in the southern hemisphere. But what I think is particularly interesting when we're talking about the link between inflammation and depression is to consider some of the emerging evidence about the role of social stress on the immune system. You know, we're very familiar with the idea that the immune system helps us defend against biological threats, like infection. But what about the parallel idea that the immune system might have something to do with our response to social threats? Again, an idea that 10, 15 years ago might have seemed a bit bonkers. But now you look at the literature and there's evidence that bereavement, for example, caring for a dependent relative, childhood adversity or abuse, all of these events in people's lives seem to be associated with increased levels of inflammation. I'll give you an example of how people have begun looking at this experimentally. This is, again, not a study of patients primarily. This, in fact, is a study of teachers. And teaching, we know, is a notoriously stressful business. Many teachers feel that they put more effort in to their work than they are rewarded by their employment. And in this study, the investigators found two groups of teachers. They found a chronically stressed group, we'll call them burnt out, and they found a more resilient, buoyant group of teachers. They brought them into the lab, and they took a blood sample. They found in the blood, in the circulating blood, they extracted the macrophages, well, they're called monocytes, to be precise, but they found the circulating macrophages in these patients, in these teachers' blood. They put them in a dish in the lab, and they exposed them to a bacterial challenge. They made the immune cells think that they were under attack. And then they measured the amount of inflammatory protein that the immune cells produced. And what they found was that the immune cells harvested from the blood of the burnt-out teachers had higher levels of inflammatory protein production compared to the more resilient teachers at baseline. And then the investigators did something a little bit wicked, which is they put all of these teachers in a situation not unlike the situation I'm in at the moment, public speaking. That is a well-known stressor. It's not, of course, as severe a stressor as bereavement, but it causes a lot of people some stress. And experimentally, you can simulate public speaking by something called the triasocial stress test, shown here. So you have the teacher, the participant, standing up in front of this panel of white-coated pundits while being asked to do mental arithmetic and judged on their performance. It's quite a stressful experience, I'm sure you can imagine. And what they found was that as a result of that acute stress, the amount of inflammatory proteins produced by the monocytes or macrophages sampled from the teacher's blood was increased somewhat in both cases. You can see after the social stress of public speaking, even the resilient teachers showed an increase in inflammatory activity of these circulating cells, but the increase was even greater in the burnt-out teachers, suggesting that chronic stress puts the immune system on a higher level of alert, if you will, and makes or magnifies the inflammatory response to any subsequent, more acute stress. That, I think, is a very interesting line of inquiry to follow on in future years. How does stress impact on the immune system, and could that help us explain why exactly stress is the biggest single known risk factor for depression? So you begin to, I hope, get the idea that we could be thinking about this sort of vicious cycle, if you will, that inflammation, whether it comes from arthritis, obesity, or social stress, crosses the blood-brain barrier, changes the way that nerve cells work, the way that large-scale emotional brain circuits work. That in turn causes changes in our mental state, makes us depressed, and being depressed may make us more likely to experience other stressful events. A vicious cycle could ensue. Now, this is drawn, obviously, at a very high level, somewhat childishly, as a caricature to get the message across. But those of you of a more sort of neuroscientific bent may be sort of encouraged to know that there is, under the hood of that schematic, quite a well-articulated biological model. Again, this is mostly based on animals, but here it is, the stress of a social threat is picked up in the brain, and part of the brain's response involves sending an impulse through the sympathetic nervous system to the immune system, causing the release from the bone marrow and the spleen of inflammatory immune cells circulating the body, and then may traffic across the blood-brain barrier, squeezing between the cells of the blood vessel walls into the brain, and there increase the inflammatory milieu, the concentration of inflammatory proteins, triggering change in neuronal function, change perhaps ultimately in behavior and mood. So there is a growing awareness of how these things are mechanistically related to each other. But so far, I've really only addressed, in terms of causality, the question how. For a completely satisfactory causal explanation, we'd also like to know the answer to the question why. Why might it be that inflammation could cause depression? And like most biological why questions, that answer has to come back to Darwin. There must be a sense in which depressive behavior is or was invoked by the immune system to help us survive. And there is a theory, an evolutionary theory, it's not mine, but it's out there, that is indeed what happened, that going back to our cavemen in ancestral times, we focus so far on what the immune system is doing to handle the infection in his hand in terms of local inflammation. But we've drawn in with a sad-looking expression. And there is a theory that part of the way that the immune system evolved to help us survive was essentially to co-opt the brain to induce behavioral changes, social withdrawal, changes in sleep, changes in appetite, that somehow or other might have helped people survive infection and trauma in an era before there were effective treatments. Now, like many evolutionary theories, and this is not the first, and nor will it be, I'm sure, the last evolutionary theory of depression, it's open to criticism as a just-so story. You know, you can make up what you like about what might have happened in the dim and distant past. But if this was the case, if there is an evolutionary story to be told about the links between inflammation and depression, one place I think we might look for clues is the genetics of depression. And as Michael Meany mentioned just a moment ago in his extraordinary talk, the genetics of depression has been a black box until really very recently. I mean, it's only in the last 12 months that the number of DNA samples on patients with depression has become sufficiently big to be able to identify with certainty specific genes associated with risk of depression. And these are genes, each of a tiny effect. But it is still, from the point of view of understanding links between inflammation and depression, very interesting to understand. Do any of these risk genes for depression that we've only just identified have anything to do with the immune system, as the evolutionary theory might predict? And this is very much still work in progress, but here's the whole genome laid out on the horizontal axis, and you can see these towers in the so-called Manhattan plot showing which genes are most significantly associated with depression. We need to understand what those genes do, and one simple way is to look them up. What, for example, does this gene do that is most significantly associated with depression? Well, it's something called olfactomedium 4, and if you look it up, it turns out to have been important in controlling the gut response to infection in mice. Now, that is not a deep and compelling genomic analysis. It's just a first look, but it's the kind of result that would be anticipated by the evolutionary theory, that the risk genes for depression should have something to do with the immune response. But so what? You know, I can talk about GWAS, I can talk about Descartes, I can do it all day long. But what difference is this going to make to the problem I started with, which is depression is the single biggest cause of disability in the world, or on track to become so, and we haven't had much in the way of therapeutic innovation since Prozac. If inflammation causes depression, then it's quite reasonable to expect that anti-inflammatory interventions might treat depression. Could that be the case? I would say maybe yes, but not yet, and never for everyone. My vision of how this might work out therapeutically is not that anti-inflammatory drugs are going to emerge as a new panacea, but that in the not-too-distant future, we might find ourselves in a situation where people with depression come into the clinic. We identify that they have that syndrome of depression, but we use some kind of biomarker, perhaps a blood test, to identify whether that particular patient is both inflamed and depressed. And if they are inflamed, then maybe there's an anti-inflammatory treatment that might help them with their depression. If they're not inflamed, well, there are other treatments for depression that could be used instead. It's a more personalized, precise approach to treatment. In almost all other parts of medicine, this would be regarded as motherhood and apple pie. You don't treat the symptoms, you treat the cause. In psychiatry, it would be quite a big step forward if we could get to that point. Now, is there any evidence already that anti-inflammatory drugs could have that kind of antidepressant potential? Well, yes, actually, there's quite a lot of circumstantial evidence. If you look at clinical trials of anti-inflammatory drugs in patients, again with psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease, rheumatoid arthritis, in many of those trials, a few questions will have been asked about mood and mental state. Not a deep examination, but enough to allow a sort of secondary or post-hoc analysis. And this may be difficult to see from the back of the hall, but again, this is a meta-analytic approach to looking at data from thousands of patients treated with a range of different anti-inflammatory drugs, and on average, there is a significant effect. They are significantly antidepressant, these anti-inflammatory treatments. In fact, the effect size, which is about 0.3, is in the same ballpark as the overall effect size of serotonin-boosting drugs like Prozac. The obvious caveat is that these are patients with a physical disease who've been given an anti-inflammatory treatment, and maybe their mental state is improved just because their joints are less painful, or they're more optimistic about their prognosis because the drug has worked on the physical disease. We can, to some extent, discount that alternative explanation. So we can look, for example, at the group of patients with arthritis who did not respond in terms of their arthritis, who were physically non-responsive, and we can ask the question, what happened to their mood state? It turns out from this analysis here that even if you look at those patients who did not physically respond, there is evidence for an improvement in their mental state. So it's difficult to discount that along the lines of, well, you would be, wouldn't you? You would feel less depressed because your physical state was improved, because we seem to see improvements in mental state even when the physical condition hasn't improved. But when we come to trying to treat psychiatric depression, depression without a major medical disorder in the background, one thing we know already is that this isn't going to be very effective unless we're clever about biomarkers, unless we're clever about targeting treatment. We know that because there's already been a trial of an anti-inflammatory drug for depression, well-designed, clever trial. And you can see here the scores of the patients treated, the depression severity scores, decreasing over time to approximately the same extent whether they got the active drug or the placebo. In short, the trial was a failure if you looked at all patients altogether. But if you looked at particularly those patients that had high levels of inflammatory protein, high levels of CRP at baseline, they showed a significant trend to improved depression. So if the implication from that study is that we shouldn't be thinking about this as a one-size-fits-all. It's not going to be the case that everybody with depression is going to feel less depressed as a result of anti-inflammatory treatment. But if we could find biomarkers that identified which patients were both inflamed and depressed and target our treatment on those particular individuals, that might be more successful. What are the biomarkers that we're looking for? They might not be single proteins. They might be changes in gene expression. They might be networks of change in gene expression. And we've seen some examples of that already, of significantly increased expression of a cluster of genes, all specialized for innate immune response, for the inflammatory response to infection in depression. This is work from Mary Ellen Lionel, who's just started as an MRC PhD fellowship looking in this area. It's a complex story here. It's a correlation matrix showing the pattern of relationship between multiple immune markers, cell counts, proteins, gene expression transcripts, and psychological markers of depression. The details are not important. The key thing is to understand that out of a single blood sample, there are many different peripheral immune markers we could measure. Many of them seem to be correlated both with each other and with mental states in people with depression. And the hunt goes on to find which of those peripheral biomarkers might be most informative. I think we also need to think about the brain. What can we measure in the brain in humans that might be sensitive to inflammation, might give us a guide to which patients are most likely to respond to anti-inflammatory interventions? Well, we can look at functional MRI. And as Colin said when he introduced me, a lot of what I did before getting involved in immunology and inflammation was analysis of functional MRI data. You can show that the connectivity patterns in functional MRI data are quite sensitive to the levels of inflammatory proteins like CRP in the blood. These are data showing that as you go from healthy controls to uninflamed depression to more inflamed depression, you progressively lose functional connectivity between components of the emotional brain circuitry in the depressed brain. And there are other imaging techniques. There's a technique called positron emission tomography, which involves injecting a radioactive tracer that targets a particular molecule in the brain. If you could find a molecule that was specific to microglia or to immune cells in the brain, that would give us a more direct read on brain inflammation. And people have begun doing those sort of experiments. These are data from John O'Brien, one of my colleagues in Cambridge, showing in elderly people with depression, the PET marker that we used that is sensitive to microglial activity is increased in binding, particularly in the cingulate cortex, in people with depression. And we've seen similar results ourselves. Biomarker discovery, whether in the periphery or the brain, is going to be absolutely crucial. And in some way, it's the cutting edge of the therapeutic approach for immunology and depression. But in finishing, I just want to leave you with two final thoughts. First, although I've come at this from a drug discovery background, I want to emphasize that the links between the brain and the immune system aren't only relevant for drug treatment. There are other interventions, like, for example, vagal nerve stimulation is licensed for treatment of depression in the States, and we know, or have begun recently to realize, that one way vagal nerve stimulation might work is by reducing inflammation. There's a vagal inflammatory reflex, a new piece of physiology that's been discovered in the last 15 years that shows how intimately the brain and the immune system homeostatically interact. So stimulating the nervous system electrically rather than pharmacologically could trade off the same neuroimmunological interactions that I've been talking about. So it's not just drugs. And the second point is it's not just depression. Anti-inflammatory interventions might be relevant for many other disorders. This is the first patient with Alzheimer's disease. When Alzheimer looked at her brain, he discovered these clumps of peculiar material, he called them. We now know they're abnormally folded or aggregated proteins. And people have increasingly become aware that the immune system might see those abnormal proteins as if they were alien proteins. They might stimulate an immune response, and the inflammatory reaction to protein deposits in the brain might contribute to neuronal loss and to the progressive loss of cognitive faculties that we recognize as dementia. So a lot of interest in the industry about anti-inflammatory approaches to neurodegenerative disorders as well as depression. And with that, I'll finish. This is the book that I wrote to try and sort of explain a bit more of the background, and these are the final sentences. We could be on the cusp of a revolution, which I recognize is a potentially grandiose claim. What I'm talking about is the idea that we might be able to step back from the dualist orthodoxy, the split between body and mind that has dominated Western medicine for so long. It won't be televised. That means it's going to take a long time. It's probably a multi-generational project, and I might be wrong. You know, this isn't all cut and dried. Some of what I've said tonight is quite speculative, but I think it has already begun. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ed, for a really fascinating lecture. I'm sure there'll be questions. Ed said he'd be happy to take questions. Could you wait for a microphone? There are some roving mics which you can see around the room before asking, or otherwise your question won't be heard generally. So are there questions, please? Yes.
Is there evidence and has there been any studies for the whether the brain is able to influence the immune system? You have been telling that the immune system influences the brain. And it also, in fact, you connected it to an evolutionary theory, but that was a very acute event of immediate this thing. But we have seen, I'm a surgeon, so we have seen in our own practice, people who are depressed are more prone to develop infections. They are more prone to develop malignancies. In fact, one of the things we used to tell the patients with terminal malignancies is to give antidepressants, so the brain influencing in an opposite manner. Has there been any studies, or you think only in this one way it works?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question, and you know, it's well known that shocks, bereavement, for example, that increased depression also increase the risk of mortality associated with rather physical disease. So it's an interesting question. It has been less of an interesting question, if I'm honest, for me. I've been really rather focused on inflammation causing depression. But if you remember what I showed you about the vagal inflammatory reflex rather briefly, the vagus nerve, which comes out of the brain, innervates pretty much the whole of the body, has a very pronounced anti-inflammatory effect. You can switch on or off, in fact, levels of inflammation in the body by stimulating or not stimulating the vagus nerve. It has been shown quite clearly. And a lot of people are interested in using and developing new bioelectronic techniques to stimulate the vagus nerve more precisely to control inflammation in physical diseases like Crohn's disease and arthritis. So that's one particular mechanism by which the nervous system, ultimately the brain, through that parasympathetic outflow through the vagus nerve, can damp down inflammation. If you ask the more sort of general question, how can the state of mind control inflammation? I think that is a much more early days. But there are, for example, some small-scale studies showing that meditation and other mindfulness practices can have some effects on immune markers peripherally. I think that needs a lot more work, but to my mind it's not inconceivable that one could, for example, develop biofeedback tools that helped people exert more conscious control or more mental control of peripheral inflammatory status. Why not? It could be a two-way street, as your question implied.
Yes, over there, if you can. Is there a microphone?
Yeah. Which?
Okay, well, there first. You've got a mic? Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, that was fascinating. So you showed how the overall efficacy of antidepressant drugs hasn't improved much in the last 40 years or whatever. I'm wondering if there's a timing effect, like if people, obviously if cancer is diagnosed earlier, then the treatment is more effective. Is that the case with depression? And if so, do you think it's to do with the brain connectivity patterns getting more lodged in the longer a person's depressed, or something to do with the immune aspect of depression?
So I think, well, one aspect of your question is depression more treatable early? I think there is some evidence that repeated episodes of depression make response to the later episodes less complete than earlier episodes. But it's not I don't think that's a particularly, I'm not sure that that's related to the immune story I've been talking about. I think one thing that we do know is that amongst the large group of patients, approximately a third, who do not respond very well to conventional treatments, there is some evidence that those people have increased levels of inflammation. So if you ask the question, who are these people with depression and inflammation, it's quite likely that many of them will be, I think, patients who've had multiple trials of conventional antidepressants, not responded very convincingly to any of them. And there could be a mechanistic explanation for that. I mentioned briefly that inflammation in the brain changes serotonin metabolism. It might, by that mechanism, make people less responsive to serotonin-boosting drugs. So I think in terms of the treatability of depression, the responsivity of depression to conventional drugs, there is some suggestion that the less responsive patients may be more inflamed. And from a drug development point of view, that's quite important. You know, if you think, where would you imagine a new intervention, a new antidepressant treatment being most effective or most successful? It's probably not going to be as a replacement for first-line treatment with serotonin-boosting drugs. It would be much more, I think, imaginable to think of a new anti-inflammatory intervention coming along as an adjunctive treatment or a second-line treatment to help people that had not responded terribly well to the more conventional first-line options.
Other questions?
As a Berliner, I'd like to remark, if I'm allowed to, that the Berlin Wall is still present. It moved to people's heads, but to people's heads only. And so, leading up to my question, do you think methods like, for example, the Wim Hof method, which is cold shock therapy to the body, like taking an ice bath, could actually be heat stimulus that can train the immune response and also cure depression in it?
Well, you know, I suppose the experience of the last several years has made me a lot more open-minded about things that I might in the past have discounted. For example, the link between diet and mood. I was pretty sort of dismissive of that, if I'm honest. But when you think about it through the microbiome, the gastrointestinal immune cells, and you begin to think, well, actually, these ideas could be mechanistically feasible. And a number of treatments that are not part of mainstream psychiatry or mainstream medicine might become more respectable if we understood how they worked. So I'm open-minded about many things that, you know, a while ago I might have discounted. But the key thing is that we need to see the science in support of all this. You know, I have been struck by the number of books, for example, calling themselves things like anti-inflammatory diet. I bought a few. I looked through them. I couldn't see any evidence that any of the dietary advice was evidence-based in terms of its effects on the immune system. And one good thing about drug development is that the standards of proof are very high. You know, to get an anti-inflammatory drug out there, you've really got to show that it works. If we could apply the same standards of evidence to non-pharmacological interventions, be they cold water swimming, diet, meditation, if we could show that those interventions had mechanistically sensible effects on the immune system which could contribute to their therapeutic efficacy, that would be a wonderful thing. I don't think it's inconceivable, but I think we need to do the science, and do the science to the same standard as we would for a more traditional pharmacological treatment.
Sorry, can I just ask, we haven't heard anything about any of the side effects for anti-inflammatory drugs or antidepressant drugs. That's just one question. I've been a yoga teacher for about 20 years, and I've also played around with, as you call them, anti-inflammatory diets for a very long time. And I can say categorically that in the laboratory of my body and my brain, cutting out inflammatory foods definitely changes your mood within hours or within 24 hours at least. So, you know, the science is not going to come from, you know, proving that diet and exercise and all the lifestyle stuff that actually works for depression and inflammation, because I also have arthritis. It's not going to be proved because there's no money in it. And unfortunately, you know, you're a smart man, but you work for a drug company. So all the money that's been put into this possibly revolutionary new research is still about drugs, giving people drugs when they have depression, when they have arthritis. And unfortunately, no matter how good those drugs are, there's always going to be side effects. Yeah. So what I'm here, I suppose, to say to people is that if you're strong enough and disciplined enough to change your diet and lifestyle and eat really well, and look after yourself, look after your stress levels, change your job if you need to, get rid of your partner if you need to, and, you know, move country if you need to. But if you want to take care of your mental and physical well-being into your senior years, then you need to eat really clean and exercise well and sleep well and do all of those things that make us happy and human. And that's just where we're at. And you're at the cutting edge of the orthodox medical approach to depression, and that's all very well, and it's great to see that things are changing. But truly, I feel that there's a much simpler answer to anxiety, depression, and all of the problems that we're facing in this world because of toxicity and environmental damage that we're doing. So that's all I just want to say. Thank you.
Well, I definitely would not disagree with a lot of what you just said. There certainly are side effects of all drugs. One of the questions I've sometimes been asked is, so, are you saying that basically I should go out to the chemist and buy a lot of ibuprofen or a lot of aspirin? Isn't that an anti-inflammatory drug, and won't that make me less depressed? But of course, they all have side effects. The anti-inflammatory drug that was used in the trial of depression that I showed you has quite serious side effects. It makes people much more susceptible to infection. If you damp down the immune system with a drug, you are going to some extent, disable the body's defense against infection, and you can see that. So there are certainly side effects, and we have to measure the risk of any treatment against its benefit. And that is, what I hope will emerge as we do more work focused on drug treatments for inflamed depression. But you're absolutely right. Drugs are not necessarily the whole story. A lot of people don't like taking drugs or can't tolerate side effects. And there are going to be lifestyle changes that could be effective. I absolutely wouldn't disagree with that. I think the thing I'm curious about, though, is how do those lifestyle changes work? And, can we... You might think this is irrelevant, but to me it matters. If I'm saying to somebody, it goes back, I suppose it goes back to that anecdote I told about my first patient at the Maudsley. If I'm recommending a treatment to patients, I would like to know how it works, and I'd really like to be confident that if they take my advice, there's a decent chance of improvement in their symptoms as a result. In other words, I'd like to be able to predict therapeutic efficacy, and I think I can do that more confidently if I understand a bit more about the underlying mechanisms. So that's why I'm curious. I'm not restricted, in my imagination at least, to pharmacological interventions. As I said at the end, there are other ways that we could manipulate the immune system which might turn out to be antidepressant, but whether it's diet, whether it's lifestyle changes, yoga, meditation, cold water swimming, drugs, electrical stimulation, whatever it might be, I would like to understand, as certainly as one does for a successful drug development program, how it works and that it really does work in the way that it's advertised.
Sorry, I had a question about, you mentioned that Alzheimer's might also be affected by inflammation, but I was just wondering about if you've also looked at other psychiatric disorders. So, for instance, I was thinking about schizophrenia and research that actually pretty similar evidence that you discussed in your talk. So, for instance, certain genes that have been implicated in schizophrenia are also thought to be involved in inflammation, and there were those large epidemiological studies from Denmark that found that sort of those individuals who had autoimmune disorders or serious infections were more likely to develop schizophrenia. So basically, wondering how specific do you think this is to depression or perhaps other psychiatric disorders being similarly affected?
Well, I think you're right. There's definitely some interesting evidence linking inflammation or the immune system generally to schizophrenia. I mean, for example, the top hit in the schizophrenia GWAS genetic analysis is a complement gene related to the immune system. And I think we're beginning to understand that actually the immune system is quite important in controlling the development of the nervous system. There's some quite interesting evidence that the changes in connectivity between nerve cells, the so-called synaptic pruning process that we see as part of normal development, is managed in large part by the immune cells in the brain. So the immune cells are important in shaping how the brain develops, and that's important because, again, as Michael Meany said in his talk, when we think about psychiatry, I think we're increasingly thinking about childhood, adolescence as the critical periods, because that's where a lot of these disorders first arise. That's when they first arise, I should say. And we have to understand, therefore, psychosis, depression, bipolar disorder, anxiety, as they emerge in adolescence. Presumably that has something to do with the development of the nervous system, and the immune system seems to have a part to play in that we don't fully understand yet. So is it just depression in psychiatry? Definitely not. I think, the reason I focus on depression is because, at least in my mind, that is the bit of psychiatry where the evidence base is currently most secure. But there's decent evidence around psychosis and various aspects of immunology, as you mentioned. And if you look, you'll find that there are immune theories of autism, of ADHD, of addiction. In a way, it's a little bit worrying. It seems that the immune system has something to do with almost every psychiatric syndrome that's been looked at from that perspective. And that, I think, is conceivable, again, but we need more evidence. I mean, some of the disorders where people have looked for links to the immune system, if you look in detail at the studies, the number of patients, the way that the studies have been designed, it's suggestive evidence, but it's not yet compelling. So again, I suppose I'm pleading for more science, more understanding. I'm not trying to close off possible avenues of further exploration. I think there are lots of ways, lots of disorders potentially that could be relevant to a sort of more immunological approach. But depression currently has the sort of biggest sort of weight of evidence in its favor. In future years, I'm confident that more evidence will accrue to help us understand the part that the immune system plays, particularly in the development of the brain, and how that might be relevant to increasing risk for the emergence of many psychiatric disorders that arise for the first time in the transition to adulthood.
I think this should probably be the last question.
Hello, and thank you for your lecture. I was wondering, have you investigated a possible link between inflammation and postpartum blues or even postpartum depression?
No, I haven't looked at that at all. But there is, again, there's a small number of studies out there looking at that. And of course, actually postpartum events are, it's quite easy to think about them from an immunological point of view because, of course, the child, the fetus, is an alien. It's a different, it's biologically different to the mother, and you can imagine how the process of birth could potentially expose the mother to antigens that stimulate an immune response, and that might be related to depression. Again, as I said already, really, my mind is opened to, or has been opened by this, the challenge of the failure of a conventional way of thinking about depression has prompted me and others to think quite differently about the links between body and mind. And once you go down that road and you start taking seriously some of the evidence, not just sort of clinical medical evidence, but some of the sort of physiological results that have emerged, highlighting the very close relationship between the immune system and the nervous system, I think it allows one to think that differently about a number of areas. And postpartum illness, I think should be understood more clearly from that immunological perspective. What I generally always say is many of these ideas that you and others in the audience have come up with, to me, they're interesting, they're conceivable. I wouldn't discount them or rule them out, but I do think in each and every case, if this is going to be credible, if it's going to stand the test of time, we do need to see good quality data. We need to see more investment, more scientific research into these areas to really be sure that we're not just clutching at immunology in the same way as those 18th century physicians were talking about black bile. It needs to be a really worked out mechanistic explanation, I think, if it's really going to move us all forward in terms of understanding and treatment, not just of depression, but of many psychiatric disorders.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a really very useful discussion, I think, and a fantastic lecture. This lecture's been recorded, so if you want to watch it again, it should be available online soon. Thanks to Anne Silk and the Silk Trust. She could not be here, unfortunately, this evening, but she'll be able to watch it herself online. So thanks to her for sponsoring this lecture. And finally, of course, thanks to Ed for such a thought-provoking talk.
Thank you.